What's up, ZBrushers? Welcome back to Z Fever. My name is Ricky, and today we are going to be talking about brushes. Anything and everything brushes. So, what we're going to be doing today, if you are not new to ZBrush, I would highly recommend moving on to something else because we're going to be going into the brush system. If you find this interesting, definitely stick around. But I am going to be touching on quite a few things here inside of ZBrush. We're going to talk about the nature of brushes, different types of brushes, and how to use them to maximize your time here inside of ZBrush. All right. So we're going to be talking about brush types. We're going to be talking about modifiers. We're going to be talking about alphas, how to use them, when to use them, things like that. This is probably going to be pretty lengthy, and I will break it down into timestamps. So if you want to get to the information that you need to get to quicker, then feel free to do so. Trust me, I've been there. I know that YouTube is not always the most resourceful place whenever it comes to quick information that you're looking for. And I'm trying to fight that, okay? So please bear with me and let's get going. I'm going to go ahead and dock this brush palette over here to the sidebar. And I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between here and just the quick menu, right? Whenever we're talking about brushes, you'll probably see me hit over here. We're also going to talk about the stroke palette, so let me go ahead and grab that too. And I'm just going to minimize this for now. And let's start looking at this. So there are different types of brushes, okay? Um, you if you open up this dialog menu and you look at things, you go, man, that's a lot of brushes. Well, it may be a lot of brushes, but it represents lots of solutions to different types of problems, right? Each brush has been developed to handle a specific issue. Well, I say specific. It's been designed to navigate certain issues that you're going to run into, right? So when O'Farrill was going through and making a lot of these brushes, he would get up, sculpt, and run into a problem, and then be like, okay, well, I'm going to write an algorithm and deal with this. Okay, so you will notice that some brushes behave quite similarly to others, right? So the clay brush and the clay buildup and clay tubes both have the same type, right? Which means that they operate off the same type of algorithm. They just have different setups by default. Okay, and you can make your own brushes. You can go through and adjust preferences and create your own brush. So let's talk about just general use of brushes in the first place. So you have topology dependent brushes, and then you have uh, brushes that don't care about your topology, right? So a good way to illustrate this point is let's go over and grab our inflate brush, which will be right there. So using the inflate brush will be a good way to demonstrate this. All right. Um, it's important to know what tools that you have available to you. And let me have a look at this mesh real quick. Okay. So the inflate brush is going to look at where the normals are facing on the mesh, right? So if you see here, you have, let me grab a standard brush right quick and just activate RGB, and well, let's fill this. Fill, okay, and then let's just draw some stuff right. So you have your mesh is going this way, and then you have your normals that are going to be facing this way, right? And so, and then as you come around, you're going to have normals that are going to be facing downward, right? So let me back that up right quick. Okay, let's go ahead and grab our inflate again. And what you'll notice is that if you're going over and inflating, let's go ahead and crank up our intensity. You will probably see some pinching, and this is a good area because there are surfaces that are running one way and then cutting a different way. So you'll see just like that. You have the surface normal pulling one way on one side and the surface normal on the other pulling on the other side, right? And so what this tells us is that this brush is surface dependent, right? It is looking at the normals, and this is important to know about, right? Because I know that I ran into this problem quite a bit whenever I was first messing around inside of ZBrush, and you can go through and try to smooth things out, but I mean it doesn't really look pretty at all. Conversely, there's another brush called the magnify brush, right? And it acts a lot like the inflate brush, but it behaves a little bit differently, right? See, it's inflating, but it's doing it from a different way. So imagine this. Let me go ahead and append a couple of things here. Let me grab a plane and let me grab a sphere. Now, this is just going to be to illustrate a point, right? Go ahead and subdivide this plane a little bit. Turn off that mesh. Grab the sphere and scale it down a little bit. Okay. So, our sphere is going to represent pretty much our brush, right? And let me do one more thing. I want to turn on double so that we don't lose sight of that. Okay, so our sphere is going to represent our brush, right? Because our brush has a sphere of influence, right? Whenever we are just sculpting, right, we see this red circle, and it's a 2D representation of a 3D object that is pretty much invisible, right? So, when we're sculpting, basically, we're bringing our object, our our brush to a surface, right? So we are sculpting along a surface, right? Now, some brushes are going to sculpt at the surface, and other brushes are going to sculpt from the inside out, so to speak, right? So, here's a good way to illustrate this point. Let me go ahead and go back to this plane, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab a move brush, and I'm just gonna move some things around, right? No real concern. I just want to make some topological changes, right? And we're just gonna use the inflate brush like we were using a moment ago. Let me go ahead and turn off that sphere real quick. All right. So if we go back to our inflate brush that we were using a moment ago, I'm gonna go ahead and crank up the intensity like we had it before. What you'll see is again we have changes in normals, changes in the orientation of the normal. These normals are facing upwards, while these normals on the inside are going to be facing downwards, while these other ones are going to be changing. So whenever you come through and you make a broad stroke, all those normals are going to be moving outward, right? They're being inflated outward from their current position, but what's going to happen is they're going to intersect with one another because that is how the brush is designed to behave. But if I were to grab another brush, like the magnify brush, right? Let me go ahead and crank up that intensity as well. It's going to behave a little bit differently, right? So at a certain point, yes, it is going to intersect, right? But that was based on the limitation of the brush, which actually opens up another discussion, right? Because brushes have their size and they also have their focal shift, right? So if you're looking at a brush and you start adjusting the focal shift, you'll see that inner ring changes in size, right? So the the smaller it is, the softer that fall off of the brush is, right? But the more negative that you go, right, the greater the influence of that brush is, and you'll see, right, it just turns into some jaggedy little mesh, right? Okay, but the nature of this brush in general, let me soften that out and lower the brush size. The nature of this brush in general is to move from the inside out, right? You can see that it is just going to push the geometry outward, all right? And there are other brushes that do this as well. So if we want to look at other brushes that can do this, let me back this up just a little bit. So the standard brush, for instance, is surface dependent brush, right? It's going to depend on where the surface is. It's going to touch the surface and the surface only. It's not going to consider what's underneath, right? But if we were to grab, say, a clay brush, it behaves differently, right? It's going to be grabbing everything from underneath and pushing it up to a specified height based on the intensity of that brush, right? So it doesn't care that you can see very clearly. It doesn't care that there was a crease there. It's going to grab everything and it's going to pull it up, right? It doesn't matter. It's behaving off of a different algorithm completely. Okay, so these are things to be aware of whenever you're going through and you're trying to make changes to a mesh. Let me head back over to this right here, turn that one off. So this is important, like if you're coming through and you've gone through and you've made a model and you want to start refining things, right? You cannot approach every everything with a hammer, right? You have to have other tools that are at your disposal. If you're making large changes, you want to use a move brush. If you need to make fine changes, you want to use something else. Because at a certain point, and usually very quickly, the move brush becomes irrelevant because it just doesn't work. Although I would be interested to see an entire piece made entirely out of the move brush. That would be very interesting, and I would buy a beer for anybody who was able to make a Bernini-esque sculpture only using the move brush. So this is important whenever you're coming through and doing things like, let's say, trying to make refinements to a mesh, right? So you want to use your your big brushes to make the largest effect on something, right? Then you want to come through and you want to be able to use your refined brushes to be able to make the changes that you need to in order to create detail and fine lines and things like that. So this is where we step off into how to control our brushes, right? So by default, you're going to have a bunch of different brushes, right? You got your blob brush, clay brush, standard brush, yada yada yada. But there are other things to consider, right? Let me go ahead, redock this thing over. So there are a few things, right? You have modifiers, and then you also have alphas. Okay, and alphas are important to a degree, depending on what you're trying to do. But then you also have your stroke. You know, these are all things that come into play whenever you're creating brushes, whenever you're using brushes to be able to get the best effect possible, right? Just because it's there, you have this tool, you got to know how to use it, right? Um, and by knowing those things, it's going to make your time here in ZBrush that much more powerful, right? So let's say, you know, let's have a look at the clay brush real quick. And the clay brush is really, you know, it's a really effective brush, and it's not, in some ways it can actually behave like the polish brush, right? Not a whole lot different. If I were to grab, say, let me hit that again. So I'm gonna hit that there, and let me also grab the polish, just a standard polish, right? The polish is going to behave much similarly to the clay. It just does. But then there's another brush called the clay tubes brush. I like to use clay buildup mostly, but clay tubes is essentially just a clay brush with an alpha on it, right? Let's have a look here. Alpha 28. It's just got alpha 28 applied to it, right? Now you can just use that alpha as it is, right? And I see a lot of people that do these things where, I think it looks cool. It really does, and it has this real clay-like look to it, right? So you got people that will build up texture, you know, and go about their business doing things like this. And I think it actually looks really cool, and I like that rough design. So, you can control the alpha. So let's start talking about control at that point, right? So the alpha is going to be highly affected by a few things. It's going to be affected by your focal shift, right? So right there, it's pretty choppy, and if I were to pull it all the way to negative 100, it's going to be even more choppy, right? But then just leave one of those. Then if I come back and soften it up, right, it's going to behave a little bit differently. It's almost like a standard brush, right? But not quite. It's going to behave just a little bit differently. So it's going to give you that, that dexterity is going to give you the power of that clay brush, but it's not going to be so intense, right? Okay, so let me go ahead. I'm a habitual smoother, right? Just works well with ladies. Just kidding. So let's see. So you have that there, and then there are other things that come into play. So you have things like Z intensity, right? So Z intensity is going to control how fast that this brush is going to get to its maximum influence, right? So I'm going to drop this focal shift, right? Because I want that choppiness to be able to illustrate this point, right? Z intensity is going to be how fast that this brush gets to its maximum influence. So if I set it all the way to 100 and cut across there, it's going to get up there pretty darn quickly. If I bring it down to say something like 13, 15, something like that, it's going to take a little longer. I'm still going to have to go back through. It's not quite as intense, you can see, right? But then there's something else that comes into play, right? And so let's have a look here at depth under the brush palettes, right? Which I docked over here. So depth is going to be the maximum height of the influence of the brush. So if I set it pretty low, right, it's really not going to do much. In fact, you're not going to see anything because it's so far down. But if I bring it out and then hit it, just watch. and let me hit the focal shift all the way back. And now it's just crazy, right? So these are things to take into consideration whenever you're working with your brushes. Okay. So whenever you've gone through and let's say you've been working on you know this is just a form that I've been working on. I've been practicing just working outside of symmetry, right? It's a good thing to do. But at a certain point, you use the tools that you have to affect certain things. You want to have that. If I'm building, say a rib cage or something like that, and I want to have that mass, right? But at a certain point, you got to start coming through and start, affecting it differently. So, knowing that the smooth brush is going to be dependent upon the topology, then I can come through and say, let's add an alpha. Let's alpha 37. That seems all right. And I want to come through and I want to start, pushing things in a little bit, to add you know, some depth, right? So I would come through and just turn off RGB. And it's just, you know, back and forth, using these things to build up contrast and form, right? Now, I'm not looking at any reference right now. This probably isn't the best at all, but I know that certain things are supposed to flow a certain way, and I'm trying to get things to read based on contrast. And the way to do that is by knowing what tools to use at the right time. Okay? Because it's either that or you constantly fight with the clay buildup. I can sit here and do this all day, and then I can come through and then push shapes in, and then try smoothing it out and hoping that it works out the right way. But it's not going to. It's just not. So know the tools, and you'll be that much better off for it. Okay. And then the last thing I want to really touch on is some additional refinements that you can add to your brush. So you can, I want to talk about tablet pressure, right? And there are two places that this is affected. The first place is over here in the preferences, right? And if you go down to tablet, you have a global preference that is either on or off, right? So if you have it off, it's not going to take into consideration any sort of tablet pressure. So by default, you probably want to have this on. You can adjust the sliders, size sensitivity, Z sensitivity, color sensitivity, and all that cool stuff, right? But each brush in and of itself has a tablet pressure assigned to it, right? So let me grab the standard brush, and this will help us illustrate this point. So if I just open up this tablet pressure, there are several different things. You can tell it that you want to use the global settings, and then it won't matter what you have down below. It's just going to use the global settings all along. But a few things that you can adjust in here is you can adjust the size, and it has this curve, right? And so you can adjust this curve to suit your needs, right? And so you can say I want the size of this at the beginning to be pretty small, and then I want it to change based on the pressure of my pen. So at the beginning the size is pretty small, and then it increases over time based on the amount of pressure that I add. So let me grab a larger brush size. Small, increase pressure, and it gets larger, right? Let me do that one more time. Small, large, and then it gets smaller again. It tapers. Then you can also you can also adjust the Z intensity, right? In the same fashion. So Z intensity at the beginning might be, you can set it to whatever you want it to be. You can have it low, or you can have it work off of a curve, right? And these are basically overrides of the global settings. So here again, almost no influence, lots of influence, more pressure, right? And then let me add another point here. Just move things around, right? So let's hit this, add more pressure. And you see, now this is based off of the tablet settings and off the Z intensity and off of the depth, right? So if I increase the depth, you're going to see a little bit of a different result. So a little increase and let off the pressure is going to change. The cool thing about all this is that if you have that, and let's say you had a custom alpha or something like that, let me go ahead and turn this alpha off. Let's just place a stroke right across his arm. Yeah, there we go. That's much better, much easier to illustrate that point. Okay. Um, if you have an alpha, or if you've created some settings that you just really seem to work for you, right? And you're happy with those results, and you don't want to lose them upon your next load up of ZBrush, you can always save this, right? You can save this brush, and you can be your own custom brush, right? And so by doing so, you can build up your own library and make things work exactly the way that you want them to. Okay, and that's the entire purpose of this, right? I want you to be able to be empowered to do the things you need to do while you're here inside of ZBrush. Okay, so that pretty much covers the entire session here. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Um, I am. If you haven't noticed already, they've already announced the ZBrush Summit. It's going to be happening at the end of September this year. I'm going to be out there, and I'm going to be visiting as many seminars as I possibly can. It's going to be out at the Nauman School down in LA. So I'm going to be asking questions. I'm going to be meeting people. I'm pretty stoked. I'm going to make it out there. So if you have any questions that you would like me to try to pose to people or anything like that, please definitely start getting them in. If you have if you're running into any sort of issues with ZBrush in any way, shape, or form, definitely let me know either through here or through the Z Fever group on Facebook. I'll leave a link in the description below. Otherwise, if you are new, please subscribe. We're going to be continuing this basics of ZBrush course, so to speak. If you're not, thanks again for watching. At the end of the day, I want to thank you guys all for watching, and happy ZBrushing, guys. Take care.